John? John?
Oh, she's
We need you. Okay.
Are you giving us a red card? Do we have to leave now?
Yeah, those are the VIP cards.
That's right.
Are you serious?
Okay, there we are. The Men's Center and Cafe very strongly take the view that there is enough compassion to go around for everybody, that this is not a tug of war, that it is a matter of our duty to look after all those of our fellows who are in distress. So again, I welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us for this occasion. The food service will begin shortly. We're not going to show our appreciation for your joining us by making you go hungry. That's not how we do things around here. The only special thing about this evening, and I think this is already, people have realized there is one table for people with special dietary needs. Other than that, you are all our special and honored guests. And I would at this point like to ask Robert Samery to speak. He is the chairman of the National Board of the Canadian Association for Equality.
Thanks very much, John. I have a few notes here. Some of the things that might be of interest for you to hear on what goes on with us and why Cafe is worth your time, your attention, and of course your money. Don't want to forget the money. Money's today. But you know, we're living in a strange time. There's a lot of social change that's going on. I can point out a number of things, but I can also tell you that these things are not recent. They're relatively old. They go back into the 60s. You know, we started off with things like the civil rights movement. We're part of that. Martin Luther King wants to make sure that everybody has equal rights. Well, we're in that group. We want to have equal rights. We want people to be treated the same way, not because of their skin color or their ethnicity or any particular group that they belong to, but because they're individuals, they're people. We go back a little bit more recently, but not much, in the sexual revolution. You know, the pill, abortion rights, those kinds of things. Those were enormous changes in how society functions, giving people equal rights. Rights for the LGBT community, obviously. All of those things set the groundwork up for the Canadian Association for Equality, CAFE. We're all part of that. Our place in those movements is fairly special. You know, CAFE, if you don't know, is a highly credible leader in the things that we do. We are looked at by mainstream media regularly. And, you know, we've got our own National Post. The CBC comes to us on many occasions, as well as many other Canadian sources. But it's not limited to Canada. The New York Times recently came to us and wrote a piece that involved us. We've had people from France, from French television, from French media come to us and say, well, what's going on? We know that you're a credible source and a leader in Canada. Tell us what's happening with men's issues. And media can be very helpful, but media can also be different. You know, we're going through times now where there's lots of natural disasters. So there's hurricanes in the States, there's typhoons in the Philippines and Hong Kong, and you'll read headlines that say 49 dead by a typhoon in Hong Kong, including women and children. Unfortunately, they're not going to tell you that the vast majority of the people killed were men. The people that are caught in the mines, they're caught in the mines today, right now, as we speak. They're sitting there with the typhoon over top of them. They're all men. They're all men. But the headline is, including women and children. So, you know, thanks for all the work that's happened in the social justice field. We've got a lot to do, a lot more left to do. And you're here today giving your time, as I said, your energy, and hopefully more of your money. And we had to get into our cars. We came up, actually a group of us came from Toronto, come here. Many of you came from much closer than that. But this didn't just happen as you sit down here. So there's a whole team in Ottawa that I want to thank for putting this together. And of course that includes John and his co-chair, Meg. Where are you, Meg? There's Meg. Jean-Jacques, Victor, John Kingsley, Jay Katsura, did I get that right? Katsira, I'm sorry. Olivia, Giuliani, Jeff Flower, Keith Savage, Masit Kaur, Eric Berweiss, I'm sorry, and James Warren. So thank you all very much for putting the effort into putting this together for all of us to really enjoy. And I haven't forgotten David Shackleton. I want to make a special mention of David Shackleton. David has been involved in these issues for a very, very long time, decades. He came to Cafe a number of years ago, did presentations for us with us, and then got to know what Cafe was about. And we got to know David, and we invited David to sit on the national board, which he did for a number of years. And he moved the board exceptionally well, made a focus of Ottawa in the national board, which I think shows how successful he was in the fact that we've got the Canadian Centre for Men and Families up and running in a very successful way. And unfortunately, as a result of him taking on this much bigger leadership role in Ottawa, he had to step down from the board. That gave us an opening, though, for John Robson to step into, and John is doing a very good job in taking over that role. So thank you very much. So with that, I'm going to leave you. I'll open the space up for people who have interesting things to say. Again, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for taking the effort to be here. And again, lots of stuff to put your money on. Lots of people to put money into the center with. Do that too, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Puisque nous sommes en Ottawa, il est approprié d'avoir dit bienvenue en français aussi. Et je ne suis pas le choix populaire pour cette tâche. Je me sens Jean-Jacques Delange.
So, thank you, Robert. I feel very cherished. Know that you think that I'm one of those who has very interesting things to say. Alors, bonjour à tout le monde. Le Centre canadien pour les hommes et les familles comporte un volet, je ne dirais pas un volet, mais certainement offre des services en français. Le Centre canadien pour les hommes et les familles d'Ottawa accueille des francophones, des hommes en détresse qui auraient besoin d'aide, autant du point de vue psychologique, légal, ou encore d'autres services qui sont axés typiquement sur les besoins des hommes. Je fais partie, moi je mène la clinique d'information juridique, et bien que la majorité des clients sont anglais, évidemment, on est toujours très heureux d'offrir l'aide en français, et on espère que ce volet devienne encore plus gros, avec la participation évidemment des francophones. Alors soyez les bienvenus, parlez-en beaucoup, parlez-en à tout le monde, et aussi donner de l'argent dans nos coffres. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Please do enjoy your lunch. We shall be joined shortly by our first speaker from London, England. And I mentioned at the beginning the conviction of Cafe that there is not a tug of war, there is not a shortage of compassion. It is not necessary to take it from one gender to give it to the other. We will be joined shortly by Erin Pizzey, and it is fascinating as well as very gratifying that she'll be speaking to us, because she is pretty much the pioneering founder of the whole movement for shelters for victims of domestic violence. And from the beginning, she has maintained that the cause of violence, interfamilial violence is not gender, but that it is something that is passed down through the generations. That it is not something that is the fault of men, and that men are not the villains in this, and that men are sometimes perpetrators, but they are also sometimes victims, and that, as in so many things, we are all in this together. I don't know if you know, Henry Kissinger many years ago said that there would never be a victory in the war between the sexes because there was too much fraternizing with the enemy. But of course, the more important message is that we are not enemies, that we are all fallible humans, we are all struggling together with all kinds of things, including this horrendous issue of domestic violence. And so in, I think, roughly 5 minutes, Erin will be joining us. Enormous credibility, having founded women's shelters and then had some very interesting experiences when she decided that men needed them too, and she will be sharing these and other thoughts with us. Again, thank you so much for being here.
1971. One of the main things I was concerned about is that you had to, if you went to the doctor for contraceptives, you had to take your marriage, proof of marriage, before you were allowed to have contraception, and various other very small items. But I went in this great hope that we were told that sisterhood would mean that women would not cooperate or cause conflict with each other or compete, but would actually gather together to make the world a better place for all of us, particularly women with young children like me, who were lonely and isolated in our houses. But it took me only a couple of meetings in these huge collectives to hear that marriage was not a safe place for women and children, that marriage had to go, and that the most important thing that we could all do is to boot fathers out of families. And it was so extreme that most of us thought it was a joke. But of course, it wasn't a joke at all. But by the time I got kicked out of the women's movement, I went off to start what I've just told you about, a small community centre for mothers and children who were on their own and had talents that we could all use if we could have a place to be, which is what we had. Now, almost immediately, Kathy came in. She's the first woman in the world to come into the first purpose-created refuge, because once she came in, it was like an avalanche. There'd never been anywhere, actually anywhere in the world, that would allow women to bring their children and leave their homes. So as far as I was concerned, and from the very beginning, because you have to remember both my parents were violent. My mother was a great deal more violent to me than my father. Physically, she beat me very badly on many occasions. So I knew from the very beginning that this was a human condition. It was an intergenerational family condition. And that's one of the reasons why, with the first 100 women, I filled in questionnaires with them. And one of the questions I asked was, tell me as much as you know about your great-grandparents, your grandparents, and your family now. And I'm not the slightest bit surprised to find that, like me, the majority of them could chase violence right the way down the generations. Certainly in my family, we had alcoholics both sides. My mother, it becomes utterly understandable why she was as she was, a very frightening narcissistic exhibitionist, because her mother died in childbirth, used and hated her. So she wasn't able to transcend the family damage. And that was my motive for opening the refuge. I knew from the first 100 women that I took in, 62 of them were as violent or more violent than the men they left. So as far as I was concerned, I needed to help those women to learn different strategies for survival. Yes, there were women who came in who were completely innocent victims of their partner's violence, as there are men. But those are not the majority. The majority, both sides, are coming from the generational violence. My problem was that I'd established my work, the understanding was there from the people who came to visit us and our research. But what I hadn't banked on, the gender feminist movement, was looking for funding, and they were also looking for a just cause, because they'd run out of steam. They weren't offering women anything, and the women were leaving in droves. And so it fell into their lap. And in 1974, they managed to convince the British civil servants, who were only most willing to be convinced that their cause, the gender war, which then they perpetrated against men, was a just cause, without any evidence, But with that you have to remember, if those of you who are in the audience who are in their 80s like me, that there was this huge climate, particularly in Canada, thanks to Trudeau, of left-wing Marxist beliefs. And Marx has always said, and Engels, including the whole of that era of communism, that the family, in order to actually hand everything over to the state, the first thing must go is you must disentangle men from their loved ones. And from then onwards, it was a hopeless battle, really. I was asked to go to America shortly afterwards to help them start their refuges. And it was a dilemma, because I knew what I was saying to be true. And I was met, as you can imagine, with an enormously frosty reception from everybody, particularly Leonora Walker from Colorado, who is one of the kingpins in the domestic violence movement. And I had explained to her, and I was there to help them open the first refuge. But it didn't get me anywhere. I was then given a lunch of honor on Capitol Hill by Lindy Boggs and Newton Steer. But from the moment I opened my mouth at the luncheon, you can imagine there was a disapproving, icy silence. And that silence followed me all around America. I then came back to England and decided that all I could do was to continue with my program for violence-prone women. And almost immediately, I tried to open a refuge for men, because they needed refuge just as much as women. So I got a beautiful house given to me for a peppercorn rent from the British government. But when I went cap in hand to all the people who were more than willing to support women and children, nobody would give me a penny to support men. And this has been one of the major problems of the entire history of domestic violence, where men will give their lives to protect their wives and their children, but men will not give their lives in order to protect men unless it's a case of war. So I soldiered on, battling. I suffered terrible violence. I was hooted at and jeered at and picketed and screamed at. I wrote a book called Prone to Violence, which is my therapeutic programs for violence-prone people, which included the women in my refuge. It was only on the shelves for a few weeks and then it was pulled. But in order to publicize that book, I had to have a police escort all around England because of threats. And you don't get a police escort unless the threats are very violent. So I am so pleased to see you here today, because for me, to see men and women sitting together and discussing the needs for families, that's the whole point of this. Because during the 12 years I ran the refuge, I changed the name, the original name, from Women's Aid, which was for a community, to Chiswick Family Rescue, because it's the family we have to rescue. It's the family that we have to put back in place. And it's fathers that we have to install back in family life in their rightful role of protectors of their partners and children. So it's a long, hard road, but to see all of you today gives me great happiness and great hope. So now I think it's time for you to ask me questions. Gosh, I wish I was there. You're having a delicious lunch.
Can you see yourself being given a job as a gender consultant at a media station or a post-secondary school like a university or college? And if and if so, why? And if not, why not?
Why not? Because nobody except gender feminists are going to get any jobs anywhere in academia. The women who most need the help are violent themselves and violent to their children. They can't get into refuges. They're exiled. They don't take alcoholics. They don't take drug addicts. They don't take women who are violent. And they ages of 9 or 12. Why Canada is probably one of the worst places in terms of, to be honest with you, it's a hate group, the gender feminist group. against men is because Trudeau, in those early days, and Senator Ann Cools and I, who are great friends, have discussed this so many times, he pumped enormous amounts of money into the emerging women's movement in Canada for votes. It's completely cynical. So they had a head start on every other country in the Western world, and probably are the most dug in. Now, I can see Dave over there because I can see his hat. Now, when I was in Canada, he and I talked a lot about this, and you now got Trudeau in charge again. This question of gender feminism, it's a political question. They are not going to let go because the money in this is enormous. The money that is handed over to refugees across the Western world are billions. So it's a gold-plated industry for women because it ring fences that, and only women can actually take those jobs. So you are now infested right the way through your society, right the way through your civil services, right the way through judiciary. Academic institutions are all now virtually feminist strongholds. And it's an enormous battle you've got ahead against you. But the more you understand the political implications, the better. I think the closest I can see it is the movement towards actually getting yourselves heard in the Senate, in the government. I don't think that one of the things that bothers me is where you get endless amounts of men talking about how many men are violent, how many women are violent. That's going nowhere. We all know it's not a gender issue. It's a political issue. And I don't know how many of you have seen my website, which is called www.honest-ribbon.org. On there is all the evidence, the academic evidence that anybody would need to recognize what has been a huge fraudulent movement. It is fraudulent for the money that has been gathered, which is supposedly go to refugees, doesn't go to the refugees. It goes to the women's movement, and it has funded it for nearly 50 years.
For the question, and thank you for explaining. I have recently experienced kind of a discrimination in the school district board and also on the Children Aid Society. But I was able to sort out one. I would say, I will read you the recent email I received on the 13th of September. It says, "Hi again. Just want to make sure everyone understands that this dad," so the superintendent of the school doesn't refer to my first name, no last name. This dad, of course, I believe she has a husband or father. This dad is not the custodial parent. He has been known to tape people secretly in the past. I never had done, I don't do it. Yes, my question is, he wants to, I just want to read this one and ask. He wants his son to go to all of March, but mom lives in the Glencairn area and mom is happy with Glencairn. At the end of June, this dad tried to say his son was being bullied at John Young by students that would going to Glencairn. So his son should go to Earl of March. When his son was interviewed, he totally discounted the bullying. He said he had always treated kindly at John Young. Roger Mills was very familiar with this parent, Bess Susan. So what my question, there is no truth. This is the superintendent of the Ottawa Carleton School Board replying to my question about a principal who has done something incorrect information. So how do we?
I want to just say this to you. I absolutely understand what you're saying, and I'm not in the slightest surprise at her reply, and neither should you be. You have to understand that it is one of the problems with men is men will use men. It's an irrational movement. What you have to keep thinking about is all these superintendents who are working in all your school systems, even if they totally disagree with gender feminism, they wouldn't dare say so. They'd lose their jobs. So what it means is you have a huge amount of millions of women in Canada who understand the system only too well, who know how to use it and can use it against the fathers of their children, which is what they do. So I'm now asking you in Canada to think through the political implications of how you can actually tackle this hugely fraudulent movement, because they are not going to let go of the money or their power. They have both now, and they're certainly not going to at any point allow men to share any of that golden goose. Thank you. Goodbye, and God bless you all. Bye-bye.
I mean, it ranges from Trudeau's assault on Canadian citizenship to Generation Screwed, an assessment of the implications of the debt burden as we go on down through the years. Also, very dear to my heart, a very successful online entrepreneur in this new world in which newspapers are turning into dusty relics. Candace's True North initiative shows us how it's to be done. So, thank you so much for coming all this way to be with us, Candace, and the podium is yours.
Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone in the room can hear me. Thank you so much, John, for that introduction and also for inviting me to speak here in Ottawa. It's always a joy to be in Ottawa. I have to admit, I didn't always love Ottawa as a Western Canadian and as a libertarian. I always kind of had this grudge against Ottawa, but then I moved to Ottawa, so after I finished grad school, I worked for the federal government for a short time. And it was here in Ottawa that I met my husband. So I can't hold a grudge against the city any longer. I've got nothing but good memories. So it's good to be back. And thank you specifically to my husband, Kaz, for taking the effort to join me here. So when John first reached out to me to come speak to you today, I was really excited. This is one of those issues that I can't get enough of. I'm so interested in it, and the more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn. And I was sort of torn on, what should I talk about? Should I provide a wholesome critique of modern feminism and all the harmful intended and unintended consequences that it has on our society? Or should I offer something different and provide a defense, a new defense from a young person on the institution of marriage and how important marriage is to both men and women and how it can help us address the problems that we face? So I'm going to try to, instead of just talking about how I hate feminism or how I love marriage, I'm going to try to weave the two together in this 15 minutes. So let's see how that goes. So if we were to ask 1,000 Canadians, say 1,000 consumers of the mainstream media, folks who read the Ottawa Citizen and watch the CBC, we were to ask them to tell us what the top issues facing girls and women in this country. What do you think they would say? What do you think that the examples would be of the major issues facing girls? Anyone like to take a stab at that? Yeah. Rape culture, yeah, that's definitely something you hear about. Anyone else? Domestic violence, press. Exactly, the pay gap, rape culture, lack of affordable daycare maybe. Something about a crisis of mansplaining or manspreading is the latest thing. Toxic masculinity, right. Everything is sort of a critique about the system loosely defined as the patriarchy. There's no shortage of these problems that are highlighted by people in my profession, by the mainstream media, and there's no shortage of women who have devoted their entire lives, their entire careers, to both drumming up anger over these issues and rallying and creating support. Imagine that, dedicating your entire life to some of these issues. They've made an entire industry of it. There's government agencies all devoted to this, to solving these supposed problems. And I think worst of all is that there's an entire generation of young women out there who are being raised to believe that they are victims, that here in Canada, here in the most prosperous, free country, at a time where women have never had more choice and more opportunity, that they're growing up to believe that they're victims of some invisible oppression. So this is interesting. I was walking, I parked my car at the Toronto Women's Hospital the other day, and I was making my way through the lobby, and I noticed that there was a sign, there's an ad campaign that's throughout Toronto. Let me tell you if this, let me ask if this exists in Ottawa as well. But there was all these signs and posters talking about something called the health gap. So you see these brightly colored advertisements and posters, and the ad says something along the lines of, we've all heard of the pay gap. We all know the pay gap is this terrible thing affecting women. But did you know that there's also a health gap? A health gap? I had never heard of this before. Has anyone heard of this so-called health gap? Okay, well, I appreciate the irony of standing in a modern, beautiful, newly renovated, state-of-the-art hospital that's built exclusively for women and women's health. One of the richest cities in the world, and to stay covered in ads complaining about women somehow being neglected and mistreated. It's funny, of course, considering that there's no men's hospital in Toronto, there's no men's hospital anywhere in Canada. And as soon as you dig in a little bit, which I went home and started Googling it, I wanted to find out about this so-called health gap. The reality is that per capita health spending on women is about 23% more than it is on men. In the US, it's the same thing. Overall health spending on women is about $1.3 trillion. It's about $1 billion for men. That's not a trivial rounding error. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. So, there's obviously a perfectly good explanation as to why us as a society spend more money on women's health. It's biological, basic biology. Women have babies, they need maternal health spending, and that's a major reason. But why do we have this hospital creating a campaign telling us that we need to spend more money and that we need to give more attention to eliminating this supposed gap? Well, of course, everyone in this room knows that the health gap isn't the only myth that's pushed and perpetuated in our society. And as soon as you do a little bit of research into any of these so-called crises facing women, whether it's the pay gap, or rape culture, or mansplaining, you realize that they're all based on just very thin arguments and mostly just misinformation. So I want to take a few minutes to just take on the wage gap, because that's the one that we probably hear about the most, and anyone who reads my column in The Sun knows that it's sort of a particular pet peeve of mine that there's this myth that's perpetuated. So depending on your source and how left-wing it is, you've probably heard about this gender gap, pay gap, that is anywhere between 13 and 30%. Of course, the dirty little secret about the pay gap is that it does not compare apples to apples. It doesn't compare doctors to doctors or teachers to teachers. Instead, it's a just totally one-dimensional look at the data. It doesn't look at any variable whatsoever other than gender. So it doesn't take into account any of the things that would determine how much a person gets paid or earns, be it their education, profession, occupation, experience, age, number of hours worked, their parental status, their union status. It doesn't look at anything. It literally just takes all the women in the society, looks at the average wage, compares that to all the men working in the economy, compares that to their average wage, and that's a really bad, unscientific way of calculating a so-called wage gap. So if we want to know what's really going on, we have to obviously compare for other factors. We have to compare workaholic men to workaholic women. When we do that, it's a bit different. There is a gap between what men and women earn overall, but it's much smaller. Even Statistics Canada, according to their data, it's only 8%. So it's not as big as what the media will lead you to believe. It still does exist, but there are obviously other factors that are other differentiations between men and women. So women on average work fewer hours than men. Men are more likely to pursue higher paid positions and professions like engineering. They're more likely to relocate for a job, and more likely to prioritize their work over other things, be it leisure or travel or time with family. Men choose to work more. And men also take on a lot more risks. So yeah, there's economic gain to that, but there's also really, really catastrophic downsides as well. Men are more likely to go bankruptcy. They're 20 times more likely to die in the workplace, and 97% of all workplace deaths in this country are men. So once again, you don't hear men complaining about the death gap, but there is a considerable death gap in our society on average. Women also live about 4 years longer than men. So far from some sort of conspiracy against women, it's the men who take on the dirty and dangerous jobs in our society, and they usually do so in support of the women in their lives, and I think that's an incredibly important point to emphasize. And again, the gap that does exist, it's mostly a motherhood gap. It's not a men versus women gap. There's been lots of studies in Scandinavia that show that when men and women start having a family, the woman's hours drop a lot, and the men correspondingly their hours increase, they work more, they work harder, they try to earn more money for their family to pay the bills while the wife is staying at home with the children. So it really boils down to the choices that women make, and not some kind of conspiracy theory or sexism or any of the things that we're told to believe. So if a woman wanted to earn more, she can. She just needs to make different choices in her life. So she could become an engineer. She could work more hours. She could choose not to get married and choose not to have children. Of course, the reality is that most women don't want to make those specific choices, and they don't. So instead of social engineering, using gender quotas, Trudeau's favorite thing, insistence on the equality of outcome, we should really celebrate the freedom that women have in their lives and continue to let women make the choices that serve them best in their lives. But that's the whole thing. That's the whole thing about feminism, is that it's not really about what is best for women. Feminism is based on an ideological crusade. It's more or less similar to Marxism. It's about claiming that men are the oppressors, the women are the victims, and that in order to fix this ongoing power imbalance, the only thing we can do is to tear down the patriarchy. The patriarchy, which is basically just our Western liberal democracy. It's basically just free markets and individual choice and rule of law. And that's how it sounds a lot like Marxism. So if I had time, I could go through basically every other one of these issues that we've talked about that affect women and talk about how they're basically based on flimsy evidence. The reality is that women have it really good in our society. So back to my original question. Sorry, John, was there something? Oh. Okay, back to the original survey question that I wanted to think about. If we were to ask those 1,000 Canadians again, those same 1,000 Canadians, those people who read the Toronto Star and watch the CBC every night, we were to ask them, what are the top issues facing boys and men in our society? Would there be any consensus? Would there even be any knowledge of what those issues are? What are the unique issues that boys and men face?
White male privilege.
Male privilege. Yeah. Well, interestingly, I Googled this, and when I Googled, top women's issues in Canada, there's no shortage of websites and campaigns and op-eds and editorials and news stories and everything you can think of talking about the issues that affect girls. When I did the same thing for boys, however, the Google results told me about the top political issues in Canada, the top national issues in Canada, and then of course I got a barrage of pages about feminism and back to the women's issues. There weren't even any search results about the top issues facing boys and men, so even Google is guilty of ignoring the plight of boys and men in our society. Now, reality, and everyone again in this room already knows, but there are quite a few unique challenges facing boys and men, and the long-term consequences of these issues, if they're not addressed, they're going to have an impact on every person in society, men and especially women. So the first and major one is that boys are falling behind in school. Schools favor girls over boys, and they often punish boys for just being boys. Boys are told that their rambunctiousness, their high-spiritedness, their competitiveness, their sort of affinity for rough and tumble play, that all these things are just examples of toxic masculinity, and they need to be taught out of these boys. So good kids, good boys are being punished, suspended, expelled from school, just for being themselves and just acting according to their nature. And this is the effect of 2 generations of feminism and affirmative action that promote girls over boys and punish boys for being boys. And as a result, women do better in school, and because of that, more go to university, more graduate. And for men, there's sort of been a corresponding drop. So as women's rates are getting better, men's are going down. And there are some things that we're celebrating women, and it's not just. Perhaps if you're an ideological feminist, this sounds great. Women are taking over the world, they're taking over the schools, they're taking over the professions. That might be great news, but the reality is that this shift in career expectations over just one generation has a total ripple effect that could have a devastating impact on our society, on both men and women. So recent data that I found in 2010 showed that about 31% of households in Canada have a female breadwinner. So the woman, the wife, is either the primary income earner or she makes more money than her husband. So if you think back about the fact that the wage gap is really more of a motherhood gap, you can think about how this will impact. So, biologically, women bear children. And therefore, men have traditionally taken on the burden of providing for his family, providing for his wife, and earning a living while the woman stays at home with the children during those crucial years. This is the foundation of traditional marriage. And it's really for the purpose of the next generation, the offspring, doing what's best for the children. And that used to be at the forefront of our thinking. This is what we used to prioritize. And so both men and women have their unique burdens, their unique responsibilities, and there is this agreed upon division of labor in the household. Probably biologically, women prefer to stay home with their kids. They take better care of the young, where the men are better suited to go out and earn a living. Now, of course, these are gender stereotypes, and they're not all true. That's what early feminism was about giving women and men the opportunity to break out of this mold. Some men are more caring and more nurturing and are better suited at home. Some women might be more mechanical or better suited to go on and take on the workforce. And we shouldn't all be bound by one rigid set of standards. But we also shouldn't throw these standards out the window entirely, and that's what feminism has done. Because the reality is most people do fit into these gender stereotypes more or less. More or less, women would prefer to stay home during these crucial years. So as women excel in school and higher education, they pursue these higher jobs, and then they become their own breadwinner. So today, increasingly, I see this a lot among my peers and women I grew up with. Women are kind of expected to forego or delay motherhood. They sacrifice their time with their young children. If they do have kids, there's an emphasis to just rush and get back to work. So women have this expectation of both bringing in money and taking care of the financials of the family, but then they're also stuck with this traditional role of raising and bearing the children. You know, it's frankly making women unhappy. Women are deeply unhappy. Statistics show women have never been less happy as they have recently. So women are unhappy, but it's also making men unhappy. Men see themselves as being replaced. They're struggling to find a role, to find meaning, to find purpose in a new world crafted by feminists that place the burden on women and try to erase men entirely from our society. So men in North America are now 5 times more likely to commit suicide than women. Many men refuse to grow up. Many are stuck in this sort of perpetual phase of adolescence. And believe me, I spend a lot of time on social media and on Twitter and YouTube, and there's a lot of men that are just sort of stuck in this sort of angry adolescent stage. And you know, it's sad. It's sad that there's this sort of crisis among men and it's being ignored. So, you know, that's the fundamental problem with feminism, is it pits women against men, it bruises resentment, it emphasizes to the point of propaganda the issues facing girls and women, and then it completely ignores and often even covers up the very serious problems facing men and boys in our society. And we really shouldn't think of these problems as sort of men versus women dichotomy, since most families consist of both men and women. We're in it together. And I think that's where the solution lies. So I wanted to weave this discussion at the end and talk a little bit about a defense of marriage and sort of the traditional gender roles that I was talking about. And I say this as someone who grew up playing ice hockey, and I was a tomboy growing up, and I used to get kicked out of class for being rambunctious too, and I'm someone who has a career, and I love my job and my career. But I think that, you know, the solution is to stop pitting men against women, and start to work together to address the unique issues and problems that we all face. So both men and women have these unique burdens and responsibilities, but we also have unique talents, unique privileges, and unique opportunities. And marriage really helps us understand the other gender, the perspective of the other person and where they're coming from. And it really makes you have a stake in the well-being of the other gender as well. So being married, I think, is like having a superpower. You have another person that can help you through the most challenging moments of your life. You also have someone who is there to share, to cherish in the most rewarding moments of your life. You have a best friend and a partner, and you know, it could be someone of the same gender, of course, but you know, typically it's someone of the opposite gender, and they help you through the challenges of life. So taking on this responsibility, having this purpose, taking care of other people, these are the things that really bring meaning to one's life. And this is the most important thing that we should strive for. And especially, you know, obviously marriage, you have to be with the right person, but they give you the confidence and the drive to excel. So not only is marriage good for your confidence and your mental health, it's also good for your physical health and your wealth. Married couples live longer and healthier lives, and that's regardless of any other factor: age, sex, race, education, income. Married couples are also significantly wealthier. People who graduate from high school get some work experience, get married and have children, in that order, are 500% less likely to live in poverty than people who don't do those things, and marriage is the single most important factor. So again, I think of marriage as a superpower, not just for those reasons, but it's also a kryptonite against the poisonous ideologies like feminism. It's hard to really buy into the idea that men are these oppressive beings when you think of your own husband, or when you think of your father, your brother, you know, your family are perfect examples of how men aren't these things that they tell you they are in university classrooms. So while the feminists and the Marxists of the world will pit us against each other and push these culture wars, I think the best way to fight back is by rejecting this narrative and promoting our own, which is tradition. And so feminists wage their war on men. We should fight back with our own ideas: marriage, family, tradition, responsibility, and duty. Those things will trump angry feminists every time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. David rightly reminds me that I must be ruthless to keep us on schedule. So we're going to go to Cassie J, and then we'll have a question period in which you can ask either Candace or Cassie questions, so that we don't impose upon you temporally as well as financially, though we certainly hope to do the latter, not only by your attendance here, but also by your participation in the silent auction. Our next guest is again joining us remotely, due in part to the wizardry of John Kingsley, who deserves a hand for all the help he gives us on the tech stuff. CCMF would be operating by candlelight were it not for John, and I think that would be very ineffective as a modern world. So Cassie J lives in California. She's an award-winning filmmaker who made a documentary, The Red Pill, looking at the men's rights movement, initially from a very skeptical point of view, but having of all peculiar things in the modern world an open mind, she changed her mind, at which point a whole lot of people who'd been happy to give her awards suddenly didn't remember her name. However, she has not backed down. We're delighted to welcome her. Cassie, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I just want to let you know I'll be a little soft-spoken because I've come down with the flu. So although I'd love to be there, it's probably best I'm not. So hello, thank you so much for being at this gala. Looks like you're having a great meal there. I really want to start with to the Canadian Centre for Men and Families and CAFE for all the work that you do in Canada. You really are pioneers in providing resources to men and boys and families struggling through, you know, the current day of misandry that we're experiencing. And probably all of you are here because you've seen it in one form or another. And it's really hard to do this work. And I've seen it firsthand with trying to get my film out there, and not only talking to my friends and family about the Red Pill movie, but also trying to get it out in the media and then universities, and just trying to spread the word far and wide, because it is pervasive all throughout the world. It's not just Canada, it's not just the US, it's everywhere that these issues exist, and they're being overshadowed and dismissed for various reasons. And I've spent a few years trying to figure out why we're here, how did we get here. It's not necessarily a new phenomenon. I think this has been going on since the dawn of relationships and families, struggles that fathers face and boys. But I do see this as the next fight for human rights that's long overdue. And I hope that the Red Pill movie helps shift people's perspectives and see the bigger picture. And standing up for men and boys is not at the expense of women and girls. And I think CAFE has been a great example of that it is inclusive and it's a safe place for all people to reach out for help and try to find resources to. Thank you so much for, and I know that they could really use your financial as well as, you know, time and just spreading the word online, on social media, you know, like their pages and talk to your friends and family about it. You can show them the Red Pill they haven't seen this kind of perspective before. It's kind of a breaker to begin with. And I would like to open up to questions just so I can talk about what you'd really like to hear about. So if you have any questions, I am here to answer.
In other words, what's the situation between states and the variety of variability, shall we say, in the U.S. in terms of support for equality?
That's a great question. And what I've found is that people who are speaking up for men and boys and on their behalf don't have a consistent political leaning or side. I mean, one of the kind of, I guess, fathers or grandfathers of the men's rights movement is Dr. Warren Farrell, and he's an outspoken liberal, and he was a Hillary supporter, and then you have a lot of men supported Trump or the Green Party, Libertarian. So I don't think the men's movement has one they tend to fall in, and from what I've seen, it's actually pretty evenly split. I think the media has wanted to paint a lot of the men's rights activists as being alt-right or far-right conservative, and I haven't seen that. I think it's actually what I've seen, especially this past year, is, I mean, there's a big shift going on in the U.S., but one great shift is seeing this middle. Well, I guess some people are calling it the intellectual dark web. Some people are calling it the new media. But it's really these free thinkers, free agents who aren't locked into promoting one agenda based on funding or something. They're really independent voices that are able to have a voice through YouTube and social media. And I see a lot of the gender inclusive, more egalitarian dialogue happening in that center middle where conservatives and liberals are coming together to discuss these issues and really understand the other side. As far as feminism, I do think that they tend to lean left, although there are a lot of conservatives that say I'm a feminist because they take it as the dictionary definition that you support equal rights for women, which I think anyone with a heart would support. I mean, it's very few people who would be against that, and I didn't find them in the men's rights movement. I didn't find anyone that was against women's equality. But they do, I mean, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I'm definitely in a liberal bubble here, and I even consider myself a liberal. But, I think I think time will show, hopefully, if within time the truth surfaces. I believe that people will start to see this as a human rights issue and not some, white male conspiracy or all the epithets that are thrown at people who try to stand up for men and boys. I really do think it's a compassion issue and a human rights issue. So hopefully we can find that middle ground between conservatives and liberals to find a space to talk about these issues with the studies and the facts to support why this work is needed. Hope that answers your question.
Next question. Yeah, hi, Cassie J. I really loved all the work that you've done, and I helped put your movie up in Montreal. We had very little hostility, but some. My question to you, because I've watched a lot of the events that were happening in Australia and as well as your interviews in Australia, the US, Canada and stuff, and a lot of people, and I was talking with about that last night with some people here, how many friends we had lost just for bringing up the subject. And I heard in quite a few of your interviews how many of your friends, hardcore old friends, that have left you. Have you ever been in the last, like, say, year or so since the Red Pill has come out? Has any of those relationships, were you able to bridge or bring back, or have any of those people that have discounted you as a friend have come back and actually started listening to you a little bit, or starting to at least fathom the idea that you might have something to say? Because that's one of the things I really respected with you in the movie, is that you came in with a certain point of view and you were willing to change with the new data that you received. So good for you, and yeah, I'd like to know if you were able to make some of your friends back.
That's a great question, and I don't know if it's because I'm sick right now that I'm a little more emotional than usual, but it does hit a hard spot when I think about the friends that I've lost through making this film, and colleagues that, you know, really supported my previous work about women's issues and LGBT issues, and not only abandoned me with the red pill, but really went on the attack publicly. I think the best part is that my family has stuck with me, and my boyfriend of 7 years, who became my husband 3 months ago, thank you, he stuck with me through this. And one thing that it did help was strengthening my friendships with the men that I've known for a long, long time. And there was someone that I've known since I was 6 who, not until making the Red Pill movie, I found out that his ex-wife threw knives at him and beat him up. And, you know, here I talked about, I will pull it together. So I do hope in time that some of the friends that I've lost will see that they think I went to the dark side, or that I'm all of a sudden some horrible person, and really they're basing it off what the media has said. So, you know, it's disappointing when people you've known for a long time would trust the mainstream media over the decades that you've known them.
So any friend you lost probably wasn't worth it, because you seem like a lovely lady. I'm interested in watching the left sort of eat itself now, because the radical feminists are now being attacked by the trans people, saying that they are evil for saying that women have such things as vaginas, which are called front holes now, apparently. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Could you rephrase that? Because I don't know if I quite got what you're asking.
So there are trans activists who claim, radical feminists who claim that women have vaginas are radical, are evil, and they should be beaten up and excluded.
Women can have penises too.
Yeah.
Say it.
They say women can have penises too. In fact, you know those pussy hats they were making? They've now banned them because they said women can have penises. So, you know, in some way the left is sort of eating itself.
Well, I probably shouldn't speak on the first part because I haven't looked into that enough, but I would agree that the left is eating itself. You know, I've seen it a lot on social media where, you know, these forums and conversations are open for anyone to watch them develop. And I have seen a lot of feminists disagreeing on what would make you a feminist, or what actually justifies you using that label. And I think that's, you know, I think that's just going to make more people leave feminism if they feel like their voice is not allowed in there, because it's just it doesn't follow a certain ideology. And I think that's one of the main reasons why I left feminism, is that I don't see feminism as simply the movement for gender equality, or even a movement to empower women and girls. I see it as feminism is for feminism. It's for an ideology that is based on patriarchy theory, and that women are victims, men are perpetrators, and no gray area. And so when that ideology really starts to seep through in debates and online discussions, I think a lot of feminists will start to question their own label and identifying with that movement, because that's probably why they didn't join in the first place. I do think a lot of feminists are calling themselves feminists based on what they heard in pop culture. I mean, you have Emma Watson, who seems like a very nice young woman, who gave a talk at the UN saying that feminism, by definition, is fighting for women's equality, and you know, how could you be against that? And Beyonce, you know, having the feminist title and big bright lights on the stage. So, you know, a lot of famous people have adopted the label, and so I think a lot of their fans are bandwagoning based on their idol self-identifying as feminists without really knowing the actions of feminists or what they're lobbying for or the history of feminism. And you know, feminism is definitely a, you know, it's like a school of fish. It's not, it does move, but, you know, if you look within the fish, you think you're all moving together, but you end up on the other side of the ocean. And I think all the waves of feminism, now that we're in fourth wave feminism, I don't think any of the waves have been in the same area. And so people who identify as feminists, I think a lot of the older generations who say they're feminists are still identifying with second wave. And a lot of the young feminists are fourth wave, which is the social media wave of feminism. And it really is based on the infographics and memes that have these short one-liner cherry-picked sound bites that sound like it would rile you up, like women make 77 cents to a man's dollar. That would rile anyone up if they heard that and believed it to be absolutely true based on discrimination. And yet that's not the case. That's not the truth of why there is a earnings gap. So, you know, that's another reason why I left feminism, was I started to see a lot of these myths being perpetuated in the mainstream media and by celebrities and by the feminist organizations to make women angry. And that anger, I don't think, was actually leading towards solving the problems. I think it was actually leading towards man-hating. And, you know, when you believe that no matter what, you're going to be paid 77 cents to a man's dollar just based on the sex you were born with, you're not going to strive to live out your full potential, because you believe you'll always be at a disadvantage. And I do believe that's holding women back. And I've seen teenage girls in tears saying that they wanted to become a female director, but if they're going to only be paid 77 cents to a man's dollar, then why bother? And so they're not even going to try. And you know, so that's why I think feminism and the patriarchy theory and a lot of these myths that are put out by feminism, it's actually harming women's minds. And when women are abusive, they believe they're justified in their abuse because they believe that they are the disadvantaged, oppressed gender from men's oppression. And so women are abusing and believing that they are in the right. And that's another area that I think patriarchy theory harms both genders. But yeah, sorry, I went on a tangent. I think this is the first time I'm saying this, but yes, I have picked a topic, and I'm going to be starting in October, and I'm so sorry you're going to be teased. I can't share what it's about. I'm very, very sorry for that. But please follow me on Twitter or Facebook, so when I do update people on what I'm working on, you'll be notified right away.
Okay, so this is going to be the last question, and then we'll wrap it up. But I want to say one thing. I'm trying to get you to give money to the Men's Center, as you know. But I will say I am also a patron of Cassie J, because I thought it's one thing to talk about the importance of courage. It's another thing to help somebody who's showing it to continue to survive professionally.
Thank you so much for what you do, the authentic way in which you do it, the way you publicize it, the way you stand up, and your bravery. It's very refreshing to see, particularly from a woman, although that's kind of incidental, I think. You spoke a great deal about the hurt that you felt by having been left. I want to share something with you, but I'm going to ask you the question first. Are there many people? Are there some people? Are there a few feminists that have come to you and said, we get it. We know what you're talking about. We want to be part of the solution to it. We've got to do it in a particular way, but we want to help. And I will tell you that I'm from Toronto and have thank you for forgiving me, and have an overview of what we do at Cafe. And there are a lot of feminists, people in the VAW field, the violence against women's field, people in the health field. Not all women are feminists, not all feminists are women, but many women do help us. Some of them are feminists. They want to be egalitarian. They see the harms that can happen and the harms that are happening to men. So some of them do it very quietly. Some of them do it because they aren't at the top of the organizations that they work for, because the tops usually run the theoretical part or the ideological part and don't want to be involved with our group. But the frontline people all understand. So having said that, what have you found?
There have been women who've come up to me after screenings of the red pill and told me, I get it, I've seen it. I consider myself a feminist, but I absolutely know men that are going through the court system or contemplating suicide or victims of domestic violence, that they are overlooked and dismissed and often blamed for the situation they're in, or have blame all men for the ills of men. And there's two things that I've identified as the biggest dismissals of understanding men's issues. One is a lot of feminists will say that, well, men do that to other men. So if we're talking about war deaths, men, who's sending people to war? It's other men. And one great counter, if you do have one of these conversations with a feminist or someone who just doesn't really understand, a great counter perspective is to talk about female genital mutilation and how that's actually initiated and implemented by the women in those societies. They do it and they push for it. And so because it's done by other women, does that mean female genital mutilation is not a women's issue? Of course not. It is a woman's issue, and you know, that is one of the issues I deeply care about as a gender equality advocate. Now, the other side of it is saying that, well, it's not the majority. So say with the Me Too campaign, the majority are women victims of sexual harassment or assault. And so therefore we can justify the wording of the Me Too campaign to be very overtly gendered, saying that it's women are the silence breakers and they're speaking out against men's actions. I mean, if you look at what's happening with the Me Too campaign, it's very gendered in the dialogue, in the language. And so my response to that would be, well, this is twofold. One is the data is very, you really have to dig deep and also go into researching these issues, understanding that a lot of the research around gender politics are advocacy studies. They're funded by advocacy groups. They're funded by feminist organizations, oftentimes doing the research into sexual violence. And so the wording and has been very specific to trying to identify the female victims. And so one example in the United States with the CDC, Centers of Disease and Controls, the CDC in 2012 changed their sexual violence survey that they do every year to include one simple question in their 2012 survey. They included the question, have you ever been made to penetrate? And so they're trying to research how many rapes take place. But before 2012, they only said, have you been forcibly penetrated? So when they added that one question, made to penetrate, in 2012, they found that of women, 1.4 million women had reported being raped in those 12 months, and 1.7 million men had reported being raped in those 12 months. Just by adding that one question. And so, you know, feminist theory and ideology in the college, in the universities, has really had the blind female victims and wanting to identify what are human rights that women are being denied and that they should have. And what I went through with the Red Pill movie was realizing that there are a lot of men's issues that I do consider a human rights issue, such as, should a person have the right to know that they are a parent? The only person that would really have that issue of not knowing they're a parent is a man, because a woman would birth the child, they'd know they're their parent. But there are women who are having children and never contact the father or tell him that he has progeny, and I would see that as a human rights issue, that you have a right to know you're a parent. So I think we need to have a broader perspective. But so that second dismissal of, well, doesn't it happen more to women? Aren't more women sexually assaulted or harassed, therefore it's okay that our dialogue around it is gendered? Well, suicide, 80% of all suicides around the world are men. And would that justify having suicide hotlines only for men? Would that justify if we have ad campaigns on TV talking about suicide to say that if you're a man contemplating suicide, we will help you? Wouldn't we see that as making it worse for the women who are contemplating suicide, because they won't even identify themselves as going through that if the media only talks about one gender having that issue? So that's why I love what Cafe is doing and the center, because it is helping men see that they could be a victim of domestic violence. Maybe they have been a victim and they never even thought of it in those terms before, because our culture is just, we have a very gendered dialogue right now. Story I will share is that I screened the red pill in small, I think it was Oklahoma actually. Yeah, the red pill screen in Oklahoma. 2 different women come up to me after the film screening, and they worked at 2 different women's shelters, domestic violence women's shelters. And they came up to me separately. They didn't know each other, but they both shook my hand and were praising the film and said, I know that this constantly contact our shelter needing refuge, and they're turned away, and we don't have anything to give them. We don't have a hotel voucher. We can't even recommend another shelter that would help them, because there were none in the U.S. up until very recently. And it's it's like 1,500 miles from most big cities. But I know that there are feminist women who see men's issues in their work or in their lives with their fathers or husbands. Oftentimes women who marry a man who it's his second marriage can see the struggle he's going with through custody, or the grandmother of the father who lost any kind of visitation with his child. Now the grandmother cannot see the children either, and that's when it really hits them that this is, it does take having contact with people who've been through that to really start to get it. And but not just contact, because I think a lot of feminists do have contact with men who've gone through this, but it doesn't register as a systemic societal problem that needs to be addressed. They think of it as just a one-off. Oh, well, that one guy's struggling with suicide, or that one guy's struggling with failure to launch, or that one guy's struggling with his son that's kept on Ritalin, or veterans issues as well. I mean, it's just, there's so many issues, and gender theory hasn't identified what men's issues are, and that's why we have the blind spot. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Cafe and the Center, for doing all the work you do.
I have the floor. All right. Okay, thank you for having me. I just want to say that when I was writing my chapter for David Shackleton's book, Daughters of Feminism, I had to come to terms with. The first one was my own inaction. For a long time, I had been aware of feminist ideology seeping into every aspect of life, from education to news media to politics, and I knew that itself was fundamentally anti-male. Its foundation is based on male blaming, and therefore it serves as a justification for male hating. Now, in my chapter, I considered the gender discourse to be something like a swarm of flies buzzing outside my window screen, something that probably didn't really bode well as to what was really out there outside my window, but it was fairly easy for me to ignore. I had more pressing concerns. And I guess at that time, there really wasn't much I could have personally done about the situation. I was just a mother of 3 plus 2, resource town with no internet for most of my time there, and always too much month left at the end of the money. So I wasn't really in a position to do anything. And the conditions in which I would eventually become able to do something, those were years away from coming into being. You know, fast, cheap internet, inexpensive technology, social media platforms that both made information available to me, put that together into a message to put out for the world. But the second and more difficult thing that I have had to come to terms with that really came home when I was writing that chapter was the inaction of pretty much everybody else. Certainly, I've met a lot of really passionate advocates for men and boys over the last 8 years, plenty of ordinary people who agree that something should be done to help men and boys or to rein in the excesses of our toxic gender discourse. But there's just a real sense of urgency that's lacking in the cultural zeitgeist when it comes to men's issues. This is not only about the feminist positioning of men as the privileged oppressor class who designed and maintained the whole system for their own unearned benefit. That obviously doesn't help. But because why would people who are not only playing life on the easy setting, but who are doing so at the expense of everyone else, why would they deserve the help of society? It's also about the traditional role of men as providers and protectors. They are supposed to be helping and saving the rest of us, don't you know? They aren't the appropriate society's compassion, protection, or concern. They're the people who are supposed to take those impulses that we feel about others and make them fruitful through meaningful action. That's what men are supposed to do. So if they can't help themselves, then how can they fulfill their role to help and provide and rescue others? So even when people agree with our concerns, it's really difficult to get them to care. And by care, I don't mean just holding the opinion that something should be done. By care, I mean feeling strongly enough about it to spend time, effort, and money on it to make things better. By care, I mean feeling strongly enough about it to put it at the top of your priority list, to make it a must-have rather than a, yeah, that would be nice item. By care, I mean being willing to march or to volunteer or to put an organization like CAFE or the Canadian Centre for Men and Families right up there with the Kidney Foundation and the Humane Society on your regular list of charitable donations. By care, I mean demanding our politicians consider the impact on men and boys of their legislation and policies the way they do currently for women and girls. Otherwise, we'll find someone else to vote for who will do that. By care, I mean being willing to risk being widely mocked, smeared, demonized, or called a misogynist, or a nut job, or a whiner. By care, I mean being willing to lose your job, or being willing to make this your job. It's really difficult to get people to care about the problems of men, or even boys, to that degree. Which is why those of us who do care, those of you in this room that I'm looking at right now over Skype, that's why we're so important. It's why CAFE is so important, and it's why the Canadian Centre for Men and Families is so important. You know, I hope that the primary goal of CCMF is to one day secure significant government funding to help provide necessary services to men in crisis and their families and loved ones. I hope that the primary goal of CAFE is to one day secure enough public support that they won't have to operate on a shoestring, mostly with the help of volunteers, and that politicians will one day have to consider CAFE's position on men's issues before enacting legislation or implementing policy. I want these organizations to be taken seriously, and I hope that one day they will. But that day, if it ever comes, it might be a long way off. And until such time, it's up to those of us here who care about these issues to the degree that such care is required to make them better, right? It's up to us to make this endeavor work with whatever help we can find. And this is a true grassroots enterprise. This is a true anti-establishment endeavor. It's a truism in fiction that there are only 7 stories out there, only 7. Every single fiction plot falls roughly into the 7 basic story arcs. Now, compassion for men, just because they're men, that's not one of them. It simply doesn't sell to the mass market, at least not yet. But organizations like CAFE and enterprises like CCMF, those give me hope that this plot, it might actually one day become one of the stories, and that it will maybe, just maybe, have a happy ending. Thank you.
So you mentioned that you're hoping that we are looking for government subsidies to sort of help us in our programs and whatnot. I'd like to throw you a bit of a challenge on this. The difficulty I have with that, I would much rather have the funds coming from the private people giving donations and whatnot as opposed to government, so as to not become a puppet of the government. Can you react to that, please?
I would agree with you that I would always prefer that the sort of the free market take care of things, for sure. But as long as the counter narrative, the narrative that men are oppressors, that men are in charge, that men are in control of everything, that they unjustly benefit at the expense of women, all of those things, as long as that's the government mandated sort of, I guess, their policy there, that's essentially the position that they're coming from. That's their worldview. And that's why these women's groups get so much funding. And they don't just get funding to help women. They get funding in order to essentially block our advocacy. So when you're looking at that one protest, the Warren Farrell protest back from in November 2014, some of those protesters were there as part of their women's studies program, right? And that protest was sponsored and endorsed by the Canadian Union of Public Employees. So these are large, we are up against the establishment. And so I guess, like I would be very, very happy if all of this stuff was removed from under the rubric of government. But I don't see that happening. I see what we can do maybe is to wiggle our foot in the door there and actually get a little bit of something from the system and get into the system that way, and maybe try to shift some of those policies and some of those politics. So, I mean, we're not going to get the gender relationship or the gender discourse out of government. That's just not possible. The only option I think that we have is to get our side of the conversation in there. So, and then maybe removing it from the aegis of government would be the next step. But I don't see operating entirely outside of government as helpful, because you look at Bill C-51. That's a bill it's passed both readings in Parliament. It's stalled in the Senate right now. It's an egregiously anti-male bill, and unless we have somebody in government actually adding our voice to that debate that's occurring within government and within the Senate, then that's going to pass. So we to have a voice in our government and a say in our government.
Women in front to get any bill passed in the government. Like for example, Bill M163, it's women, peace and security, because they couldn't get the peace initiative or the Department of Peace, so they can't go to get the ambassador for peace with a $20 million allocation. So I would suggest that we will appoint an ambassador who has experienced a politician to get the cause and talk to the MPs. So that way it will be very effective. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's one thing to talk to government. It's another thing to get them to listen. Like in the UK, Philip Davies, he's a Conservative MP. He's been very, very outspoken on men's issues. He spoke at the 2016 International Conference on Men's Issues on the gender justice gap, or the gender sentencing gap, whichever you want to call it. But he's just been he's been an absolute bulldog in terms of trying to get men's issues on the table in Parliament and in the, up for debate. Things like male suicide, which is the largest killer of men under 49 in the UK right now. It's the highest, it's the biggest avoidable cause of death of men under 49 right now. And I mean, he was laughed at for trying to essentially propose a debate on men's issues for International Men's Day a few years ago by a feminist MP named Jess Phillips. And she held herself up as the victim of a campaign of harassment for being called on laughing at men's issues. She literally said, yeah, when I have parity here in government, then you can have your debate on men's issues. Now, women's issues in the UK Parliament are debated the third Thursday, I believe, of every single month, and then they have an entire day devoted to women's issues on International Women's Day. So, and she said, oh, the idea that men don't have a voice in Parliament is ridiculous. And he said quite plainly, there's a difference between men being able to speak in Parliament and speaking about men's issues in Parliament. But she just absolutely wouldn't hear of it. And she was sitting on the committee that inevitably made the decision to do that. And she got so much public blowback from her insensitivity, I guess, on these issues, particularly seeming to laugh at the, when he brought up the rate of male suicide, that they eventually did get their debate. But it's a really, really, really difficult slog through to even get anybody to listen to these issues within government. But I think it needs to be done. Government are the ones who legislate. They're the ones who decide policy. If we don't have somebody there speaking for us, and we do need more people there speaking for us, then absolutely they're going to pass whatever is best for women, particularly with the in Canada with the minister responsible for women, that the status of women. They have a tremendous veto power in terms of even what information is exchanged between government departments. And so we're looking at having to try to get something similar up in government, because I don't think there's any extracting women's issues from government at this point. So, yeah. Thank you.
When was the last time the government did not pose regulations on a man's body, impose? And until very recently, in the historical scheme of things, whether by democratic governments or absolute monarchies, men's bodies have been co-opted in the form of military service without their consent since time immemorial, until World War II, when military service became voluntary in most of the free world, almost coincident with the arrival of the pill, which gave women control over their reproductive functions. The difference is, of course, that notwithstanding Margaret Atwood's lurid projections in The Handmaid's Tale, if the nation were at risk of invasion, the military draft would be reinstated. But women in Canada or any other democratic country are never going to be forced by the government to bear children they don't want. And even in countries where women are drafted, they are not obliged to serve in combat. A woman who does not have an abortion after 18 weeks of pregnancy may endure several months of inconvenience, but a man whose body has been put at the service of the state in combat not only suffers extreme inconvenience over every minute of every day of his service, normally a much longer period than pregnancy, he runs a very high risk of ending up maimed or dead. But I was not surprised to see the woman's question posed, because the wrongs that men do are front and center in our cultural consciousness, but the sacrifices men make and are expected to make as a matter of course are taken for granted. I ended that column with the observation that Both sexes have bodies. Throughout human history, the primary purpose of those bodies have been divided between reproduction of the species and protection of those who reproduce the species. Now, the woman who posed that question represents a cultural condition mirroring a neurological syndrome called hemispatial neglect. It's also known as do you know about this? Also known as hemiagnosia. Hemispatial neglect is a rare phenomenon in the neurological world characterized by the inability of those afflicted to process and perceive stimuli on one side of their environment. The most striking feature of the condition is that the victim not only fails to see what is usually in the left field of vision, but is also unaware of the fact that the other side of the environment even exists. So it's not like blindness, because a blind person knows they cannot see. The person suffering from hemispatial neglect does not realize that he or she cannot see half of what is under their nose. If you put a plate of food in front of a person with hemispatial neglect, he will only eat the food on the right side of the plate, and he will believe he has finished it. In the cultural version of this affliction, the condition is not rare at all. Indeed, it's remarkably common, affecting almost all academics in our university humanities and social science departments, most politicians, and most media commentators. Cultural hemiagnosia presents as a failure to see or even to be aware of the fact that half the population, the male half, are victims of violence or injustice or false allegations or educational neglect or anything that requires society's active sympathy or special resources to redress. I have addressed this affliction on several occasions, and today I was going back over past columns that I wrote, even years ago, to find some good examples of this, and I'm going to bring up a few because I believe that these issues deserve a second reading, kind of, because they've been forgotten. And I remember at the time how agitated I was, and they've fallen off the map, so I want to bring them back for a second look. In December 2010, Cornwall Inquiry Commissioner Justice Normand Glaude issued a 2,400-page report deploring the systematic, decades-long failure of the Ontario Provincial Police, the provincial government, the Catholic Diocese, the Ontario Correctional Services, and other institutions to deal appropriately, when they dealt at all, with sexual abuse of boys and young men by an alleged pedophile ring involving 15 priests, lawyers, doctors, and probation officers in the Cornwall area. Do you remember that Cornwall inquiry coming back? The Cornwall story began in 1994 with an altar boy's charge that he had been abused by a priest. It broadened into the OPP-led Project Truth, which in turn raised so many questions that it morphed into the $50 million Cornwall inquiry involving 4 years of hearings, 167 witnesses, and 3,640 written exhibits. In his thoughtful assessment of the scandal's chronology, Justice Glaude called on the province to fulfill 235 recommendations. But a funny thing happened between the published recommendation and the media's reportage of same. All the mainstream media covered the report's release, but even though all the victims relating to the 114 charges laid in Project Truth were boys and men, and even though in his 75-minute verbal statement, Justice Glaude referenced males or men as those abused 17 times, almost all references in all media were to victims, the vulnerable, young people, children, and youths. The CBC referenced men as offenders, but the abused only as victims. Only the National Post referenced specifically to male pain twice, and the Globe once. This is hard to understand given the report's statements below. These statements come out of the report. Institutions faced with allegations, quote, did not understand the serious impact of abuse or about responses typical of boys and young men. quote, lack of training, particularly in the area of abuse of boys and young men hampered even well-intentioned individuals. Quote, police forces were not well equipped to provide support to victims of historical sexual abuse, particularly men. And, quote, I have concluded that as a society we must recognize the impact of historical abuse and respond more appropriately. In particular, the needs of male victims must be addressed. Particularly negligent in the light of the dire need for services for boys and men suffering sexual or partner abuse was the media's omission of this important nudge. Quote, men need integrated and coherent plans for services and a way of tracking and measuring implementation and effectiveness of services. Right now, there is no integrated plan. For Ontario women in distress, at the time there were 39 permanently funded shelters and numerous other programs. For Ontario's male victims of intimate partner violence, straight or gay, there was no dedicated shelter at all, only the precariously funded The Men's Project in Ottawa, offering healing and support services. There was also a Cornwall branch, apparently for show, since the government closed it down as soon as the inquiry finished. So, how many people today are even aware that there was such a thing as a Cornwall inquiry, or remember the disgrace of those pedophile rings? I have never seen them mentioned since then. Never. I am sure the boys who were victims in this scandal bear the same psychological scars as those children who were abused in the residential schools. But compassion for males in our society wears an identity politics face. If you are a male member of an official victim group, you will find sympathy from our cultural elites and the media, and especially from our lachrymose Prime Minister. If you are not, you will find yourself in the oubliette of gender history. Another gender study I covered showed how deeply boys' invisibility had penetrated the health system, allegedly Canada's most sacred icon for universality of service. In 2000, Marion Boyd, a former Attorney General in Bob Rae's Ontario NDP government, convened a publicly funded task force on the health effects of women abuse for the Middlesex London Health Unit. Its advisory panel included representatives from London's hospitals, community agencies, the judicial system, the police force, psychologists, and the then director of London's Children's Aid Society. Everyone on Boyd's panel was intimately familiar with the 1980s era abuse scandals, and some would later testify at the Cornwall inquiry, almost entirely, as mentioned, about boy victims. Yet, astonishingly, all signed off on Boyd's final report, which recommended a health unit protocol for screening only women 12 years and older for present or past abuse. RUX was proudly bruited to the 137,000 registered nurses of Ontario as a best practice. That's 137,000 women, I'm sure, or 136,729. In separate telephone interviews, I asked two of these registered nurses' spokeswomen to provide an ethical rationale for RUX. Their explanations were, there is no evidence to support the screening of men at this time. This is after the Cornwall report that I just referenced. Or, we know it is helpful for women, but we don't know if asking men about their past is helpful. And another said, screening boys may do more harm than good. Particularly disingenuous was the assertion that male abuse issues are understudied. That was one explanation I got. Well, it's we really don't know a lot because it's understudied. Well, that was nonsense, because impeccable research abounds, which the RNAO, I suspect for ideological reasons, under-consults. So they're not understudied, they're under-consulted. As a merely curious layperson, via a few queries and Googlings, I had no trouble whatsoever finding credible peer-reviewed research on exactly this topic. Taking one example of many, in a 2005 article in the Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Nursing, one finds a study concluding, quote, "Sexual abuse is a serious problem, but the boys and men who have been abused rarely report this experience unless asked during a therapeutic encounter." So in other words, if they were admitted to the hospital for another reason and they were asked, they would reveal that. And, quote, "Those professionals who do not screen both boys and girls for abuse are not meeting professional obligations by withholding services that they know or should know would be beneficial to their patient client." So she could have Googled that and found that article too. Well, I promised you both Invisible, that was Invisible, and Invidious, so we'll go onward to Invidious. Invidious comes in two models, light and heavy. Light is what you see when you turn on the TV, and you see a comedy series where there's both a mom and a dad. The mom is smart and witty and looks great. The dad is a slob, incompetent, or a subject for mockery by both his wife and children. Likewise in ads. You've seen this a million times, I don't have to go into, although the ads are changing, by the way. There are some good ads that really show men in a very good light, and that's changed over the last, since I was doing this research, that changed a lot. And then there is Invidious Heavy, and that can be all summed up in this one article, which many of you may have seen. Why can't we hate men? This article is by Susanna Danuta Walters, a Northeastern University professor of sociology and director of its Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, which appeared in the Washington Post on June 8th, this June 8th, entitled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And in it, she catalogs all the usual crimes of toxic masculinity, sexual violence, terrorism, mansplaining, higher wages, better jobs, etc. The world as seen through her hostile lens is binary. All women are vulnerable, all men are a risk to them. But she's also very funny. She doesn't mean to be. She says, the world has little place for feminist anger. Right? Funny. It ends with a paragraph that kind of says it all. So men, if you are really with us, hashtag with us, and would like us to not hate you for all the millennia of woe you have produced and benefited from, start with this. Lean out so we can actually just stand up without being beaten down. Pledge to vote for feminist women only. Don't run for office. Don't be in charge of anything. Step away from the power. We got this. And please know that your crocodile tears won't be wiped away by us anymore. We have every right to hate you. You have done us wrong. Hashtag because patriarchy. It is long past time to play hard for team feminism and win. That's quite a pep talk. So how is this article a horror show? She did get a backlash. It's a horror show, this article, but so let me count the ways why. Okay, it describes oppressor status to an entire class of people and oppressed status to all members of another class. This is evidence of a totalitarian mindset. 2, it posits a state of original sin which is inherent in maleness, with redemption possible only through self-sacrifice. I'm finished, I've got 2 seconds. On women's behalf, and hey, you told me 20 minutes, and a handing over of power. It misconstrues and stains the precious word right. It is hate speech, but mostly it is a horror show because a respectable mainstream newspaper thought it was fit content for their pages, which tells us a great deal about what is culturally acceptable discourse in our society. All invidious gender discourse is a variation on this piece. This is merely the most candid. The good news is that the article attracted a great deal of negative attention and even demands that Danuta be fired or at least censured by her university. The bad news is she wasn't. But perhaps this is asking too much because, after all, it's still only 2018. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I assure you that absolutely nobody nodded off, and I made myself terribly unpopular by drawing your attention to the time. But I was obliged to do that because our next speaker is coming in by Skype, and we're on a tight schedule here. Warren Farrell is often called the father of the men's movement. It was his books that, I would not say that it made men's issues mainstream because we're still working on that, but certainly gave them a kind of legitimacy and exposure they had never previously had. His most recent book is The Boy Crisis, Why Our Boys Are Struggling and What We Can Do About It. And he will be joining us as an avatar as soon as the technology decides to behave itself.
Can we ask our questions to Barbara afterwards?
Yeah, we will try to make time to do the questions. I was pledged to be ruthless, so I will be the one who's unpopular, but it is... one of the things that I think is extremely important about gatherings is that you make a commitment to your audience that we will take so much of your time and not more, that if you are told you can leave at 4, we will in fact unlock the door at 4 o'clock. And so there will be plenty, there will be time for talking. We'll try and make some time for formal questions, but we will ensure that we keep to our program because we really appreciate that people's time is one of their scarce resources and that you have taken an entire afternoon to be with us here today and we are going to treat your time as valuable.
I'm assuming if there isn't time to ask Barbara a question, we can certainly bid on the 2 books that she's in the charity, correct?
You can certainly bid on the 2 books that she's in the charity. Thank you very much. I think you're going to get a free item. You're doing a great job of helping us here. I was afraid you were going to mention that the pen had stopped writing 3 days later. Quite the reverse. The pen is phenomenal, folks. And so is a great deal of the other merchandise. Are we good?
I can. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you. Well, great. David asked me to talk with you a little bit about developing programs for that will be in the service of men, and so I'm going to spend a minute. I'm going to offer about 16 different programs that I think can be helpful, but I'm going to sort of spend a minute sort of giving you the logic behind that. What I have found is that boys are having problems in all developed nations. And developed nations have in common the fact that there's the luxury, there's the ability to survive has been taken care of to a larger degree than has ever occurred in history before. And as a result, the societies give permission for 2 things that they haven't given permission for in most societies previously. One is for divorce, and the other is for women to have children without being married. And both of those are fine as permissions per se, but in both of those groups, the groups where there's large amounts of divorces and large amounts of moms having children without being married, there are 2 groups of people that happen from there. One is children that are raised by single moms that do not have significant involvement with their fathers and mothers. And the other is children that are raised that do have significant involvement with their fathers after divorce and also when they're growing up without being married. And it's in that group where there is what I call dad-deprived boys as opposed to dad-enriched boys, which is a very large group in both of those divorced families and in moms that have children without being married families where the problem lies with boys. That is, boys who do not have a significant amount of father involvement, for example, have, excuse me, have problems in more than 70 different areas. Their sisters also have problems in most of those 70 areas, but the 70 areas are not as damaging for the sisters as they are for the brothers. As it turns out, whenever there is any type of emotional disruption, whether it's family disruption, boyfriend-girlfriend disruption, moving to a different location, all of those are significantly harder on boys whose emotional skills, emotional intelligence, coping skills, social intelligence is not as well developed and as refined as boys is. And so I'll just give one example and then go into some programs that I think can counter that. So just one example in pediatrics last year, there was a study showing that at the age of 9, that boy, which is the age at which the length of one's telomeres best predicts one's life expectancy. So at the age of 9, the telomeres, which are the inside of every cell, there are telomeres, and the telomeres are what holds your genes and your ability to be able to prevent diseases like cancer or heart disease and almost all your diseases. And so the shorter your telomeres are, the shorter your life expectancy. So 14% shorter telomeres are likely to predict approximately a 14% shorter life expectancy. So at the age of 9, that's one of the crucial turning points. So there was a major study done of children who did not have versus children who had significant father involvement at the age of 9. And they found that and had not had significant father involvement for many years, or conversely had significant father involvement for many years. By the age of 9, those children, the brother and sister, when you average them together, had on average 14% shorter telomeres by the age of 9. But the boys' telomeres were then again 40% shorter than the girls. And so this is just 70 different examples of the power of the lack of what I call dad-deprived boys versus dad-deprived girls. And you can see in that example that the dad deprivation hurts both the boys and the girls, but hurts the girls boys at the 40% shorter, stronger level, or the more potent, more damaging level than it does their sisters. So, and obviously, when you have the same family, you have the socioeconomic factors controlled for, and many other factors that the study was prepared to show for. So, in studies of people moved to different locations that were the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the United States moved people from poorer locations to better locations with better schools, which they predicted would have a very positive impact on boys and girls. Positive impact on girls, but their brothers, it had a worse impact on. It led to depression because the boys did not know how, and alienation and withdrawal into video games and porn, because the boys did not know how to adjust nearly as well. So on the surface level, the boys seemed to be just fine, no problem, no emotions, no crying or less crying, and so on. But it was exactly that repression of emotions that was a sign of the problems of being able to readjust. So now I'm going to focus a little bit on programs that I think that could be funded effectively as people become aware about these things, and I'm going to be working a little bit, not always from programs directly related to boys, but if you look at the divorce issue, and we ask a deeper question, which is, how do we prevent divorces? And we have a choice. We could legislate against divorces, or we could teach people how to communicate so they have better marriages and fewer divorces. And my preference is to teach people how to communicate more effectively so they have better marriages and fewer divorces, because they enjoy living together, and also and that allows their children to see a model of better and more effective communication. So I'm going to do programs that are always, as I said, sometimes they're a step away from the actual boys' issues, and sometimes they're directly related to the boys' issues. But so a combination, I think, of both of these, I think, might be helpful. So the first, I think, well, the biggest misunderstanding that I found in doing the research for the boy crisis was not understanding the difference between dad-style parenting and mom-style parenting. Almost all moms spend a certain amount of time reading parenting magazines, reading books, and talking with their mothers and women friends about parenting. And so women have a knowledge of how important protecting children is, how important being sensitive to children's needs are, and they and probably biologically combined with that, that nature and nurture combined, they do a really good job at doing that. And we all know that women, way the women that I dated between the two marriages that I have, my current marriage and my former marriage, almost always the word they used most frequently was the word, aside from the phrase "I love you," was the words overwhelmed, and we know how overwhelmed women become with just often with children. And I think the involvement of fathers is something that can really reduce that overwhelm. But beyond just reducing it from a time factor, there's an enormous misunderstanding in almost all developed nations between the difference between mom-style parenting and dad-style parenting. And so dad-style parenting will typically focus more on roughhousing, focus more on boundary enforcement. Those are the two, I said roughhousing and boundary enforcement very quickly, but those are two examples of 10 significant differences between dad-style parenting and mom-style parenting. And dads are not good at doing their homework about what the value of boundary enforcement is and what the value of roughhousing is. And so dads who roughhouse, usually a mother is looking over at the dad roughhousing with the children and thinking, oh my God, I feel like I just have one more child here to monitor. And she's sort of trying to not interfere, but at the same time, she's sort of seeing that the kids are having fun, but she's predicting that sooner or later there's going to be an accident, and she's about 100% likely to be right. But the fathers don't explain what is going on, the importance of the bond that is being created as they roughhouse, the importance of that bond being able to be used for boundary enforcement, the importance of boundary enforcement being able to be used to create postponed gratification, the importance of roughhousing to developing empathy. No one would ever have predicted that roughhousing, an increase in it, produces empathy. But the dads use their ability to, the bond that they create from roughhousing, to be able to say to the kids, Jimmy, if you keep pushing Jane, your younger sister, like that, I'm going to stop roughhousing. And then dad's tendency to enforce boundaries leads to the children to know that if they do push Jane again, and they don't think of Jane's needs, not just their own needs, to win at the wrestling match that they've all set up, then they're going to lose their roughhousing. And dad's tendency to enforce the boundary of his threat to stop the roughhousing if John continues to push Jane teaches John that he has no option but to think of Jane's needs, and teaches Jane to think that she has no option to think of her brother's needs. And so the data shows that there's an enormous increase in empathy when children have dad-style parenting, and the more time children all around the world spend with their fathers, the more empathetic they're likely to be, the more they're likely to be able to distinguish between being assertive and being aggressive, and the more they're likely to, as a result of those ability to make those distinctions, the more likely they are to have friends. The more likely they are to have friends, the less likely the less likely they are to withdraw into video games. The more likely they have boundary enforcement, the more likely they are to be able to finish their homework, to rehearse for being a good rugby player or an ice hockey player, and do all the drills that are necessary to become proficient at that. And therefore, the more praise they get from their teachers, their peers, and the prouder they make their parents at home. And so therefore, the less likely they are to withdraw games, and then as they get a little older, porn. So that being the background, here are some of the programs that I would suggest. Training parents on dad-style parenting and mom-style parenting, the differences and the communication skills that it takes for both mom and dad to hear each other's differences, rather than interrupting each other by explaining why their style parenting is better. And so through the combination of that communication skills training, creating what I call checks and balance parenting, where you get the best of mom and the best of dad style parenting. So the child learns that yes, it can. So dad and mom learn how to negotiate, allowing the child to climb the tree to a certain height, and to be attentive to the child's needs to be safe, but at the same time, understanding the increase in IQ that occurs and confidence that occurs when the child takes the risks to climb that tree to begin with. So that's just a few examples of that type of programs. Now those types of programs can happen in schools, through WISE, but I suggest that the beginning of this process is that we start those programs in schools, working with PTAs to create mom and dad style parenting, and so that's one. Number two is the more that we move away from needing boys to be our heroes in war, and the more we move away from needing boys to be the sole provider as a definition of masculinity, the more, if men are not earning money and they're not dying for us in war to such a great degree, women are going to want something from men other than money. And one of the things that they'll want from men other than money is emotional intelligence. And one of the ways to start that emotional intelligence quickly at an early age is to, in first grade, second grade, third grade, teach boys and girls how to communicate, not just with each other, that is boys versus girls, but also boys to boys and girls to girls. And so that empathy training and sensitivity training, which has been tried for years now, to great benefit in terms of reduction of depression and reduction of homicide and suicide rather, has been really very effective. And so instead of having bullies versus bullied, we need to be able to have the communication so each person understands the human being that every child in that classroom is. So because when you're far less likely to bully somebody who you have compassion for and and once children learn how to communicate effectively, they've established the underlying framework for not having to being able to communicate with their eventual partner, and therefore not have divorces, whether they're heterosexual or gay. And so that was example. But the important caveat there is if you're training boys and girls to communicate at a very early age, you need to also simultaneously train their parents. Otherwise, you have the boy and girl going home having communication skills and having a contempt for their parents, not having the type of communication skills that they have. And then that creates a different type of disrespect between the children and their parents that undermines family stability. Another program that I would suggest is to work with psychologists on looking at, in the Boy Crisis book, I have 60 signs of depression and potential suicide, 60 red flags. And we have done a really good job of identifying the red flags that are signs of depression in girls. And girls manifest their signs of depression much more thoroughly, effectively. In college, for example, the counselors in college are used 75% by females, 25% by males, but 75% of the suicides in college are by males, not females. So you can get a sense of the importance of the helping professions knowing how to identify the red flags of depression that could potentially become the suicide also, or in male style. So suicides are sometimes not just suicide, but they happen with school shootings or mass shootings or joining ISIS or whatever. Boys who hurt us as well as hurting themselves. They commit both suicide and homicide to a greater degree. Working with a third program is to work with educators and parents on what I call the 18 ways that I discuss in the Boy Crisis of combining heroic intelligence with health intelligence. And so for those of you who have read the Boy Crisis, you know that I distinguish between heroic intelligence, which is training for a short life, versus health intelligence, which is training for a long life. And one of the things I discuss is how parents and society have given boys very mixed messages. We tell them to be safe as we send them out to play football. We tell them to come home safe as we send them into the military. And those are and we feel proud of them when they serve in the military and are train themselves to be disposable. But we also hope that they manage to not be disposable. And so we have to be much more conscious of what these mixed messages are, the mixed messages between heroic intelligence and health intelligence. And I would say that training boys to be effective as heroes was very good training for life in the past, but training boys to be successful health in a different way, in a way that combines the best of heroic intelligence and the best of health intelligence, is training our boys to be successful in the future. I think we need to educate a fourth program. We need to educate educators on 4 things. One is the purpose void. Why boys had purpose in the past, but have much less purpose in the future and at present. What that purpose void is, and the danger of connecting that purpose void compounding that purpose void with a dad void. So when boys have a purpose void, they have more needs for dads to give them a sense of purpose to fill that void. Otherwise, they tend to take their testosterone and channel that sense of purpose in a very negative way rather than in a positive way. Third, we need to make every parent aware of this difference between heroic intelligence versus health intelligence. And fourth, we need to be aware of why boundary enforcement is such a good antidote to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what are the other 30 or 40 non-prescription treatments ADHD children can receive before we prescribe drugs to them? Or if we do prescribe drugs to them, having these other treatments and approaches be a bridge to getting rid of the drugs rather than becoming drug dependent. Next, I think doing cooperative programs with the Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the Ys, the Mankind Project. These cooperative programs, I think these institutions are already available. They have a very good history of developing the best of masculinity rather than the worst of masculinity, and that is, I think, would working with these groups, I think, would be very helpful. Mentor programs. Everyone knows that mentors are really good for boys, and we need to work with single moms in particular who to first of all understand the importance of dad, so that rather than bad-mouthing dad, she does everything possible to identify the contributions that dads tend to make and try to bring dad back into the family again where possible. Sometimes it will not be possible. Where it's not possible, we need to work with single moms on mentor programs. So every boy has a mentor, that boys get involved in the Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the Mankind Project, and so on. But more importantly, that what is less frequently understood is that boys not only need to have mentors, they need to be at as young an age as possible, they need to be mentors. Boys' development happens at a quicker pace when they are looking at themselves through the people that they can help and be mentors to. So rather than do something destructive, they start saying to themselves, if I do that, how will I represent that to the boy or girl that I'm mentoring, usually the boy that I'm mentoring, and how will that look to them? And I'll be a disgrace to them, and therefore they tend to mentor themselves more effectively when they have responsibility for somebody else and have that sense of purpose in their life. We need to, for intact families, we need to work with intact families on how to structure family dinner nights. Family dinner nights are one of the greatest predictors of a child's success, but family dinner nights can become family dinner nightmares. And I found that to be so frequent, I ended up creating a whole appendix in the book on how to construct the family dinner nights so that they would end up becoming constructive rather than destructive. I'm getting the time sign, so I'll allow you to take a look through the boy crisis and develop and work with other programs, whether it's instead of working with STEM professions, developing caring professions, instead of working with flag football, developing tackle football only, developing flag football programs in the school systems, sending out the messages to train fathers to be what I call father heroes. And so I will let it go there because the time is up, and thank you for your time. Yes, I've been working every week for the last 9 to 10 years now to try to create a White House Council on Boys and Men, and we almost did it with the Obama administration, but Valerie Jarrett knocked us down, saying that we have too much boys and men already, and we shouldn't take away from girls and women. So she was looking at boys, men, and women and girls as zero-sum games, and from my perspective. When only one sex wins, both sexes lose, and we need to all work together because we're all in the same family boat. So we didn't quite get it through with the Obama administration, and now with the Trump administration, we're having some receptivity in the Department of Education, but we have not moved up the ladder yet to get the attention of the very upper echelons of the U.S. government at this point. So every week we are meeting to work on ways of making this happen, and but we're still working on it. And so part of my reason for devoting 11 years to the boy crisis is that I felt that one of the things that every politician says is I can't move unless the country at least is part of the way there, because otherwise I lose my ability to be reelected. And so part of what I need to get out, what I felt the boy crisis would do, is to get out into the society the need for boys, how the challenge boys are facing, and what the constructive solutions are, which ones can be done by individuals, which ones by groups, which ones with government help, and how the government can help stopping the subsidy of families in which fathers are absent. And so all of those issues need to be worked on. But first, the need for that to happen, and the need for the crisis to be on the conscious level needs to occur before politicians are willing to move and risk their careers to support that. As you know, in Canada, Senator Ann Cools did a very good report about 15 or so, maybe 20 years ago, on what was happening with boys that really has not been heeded to the degree that it needs to be. Thank you. It's real.
We're making progress, and that's all I'm going to say. Because what I want to do here at this fundraiser is tell you why this organization is special. And what it comes down to is always people. I've worked with the team that is running this center now for some of them for 4 years, some of them probably none of them less than about 2 years. These are exceptional people. They really are. Supporting men isn't for the faint of heart. It's not for people who can't stand up when faced with an opposing social consensus. The people on this board of the center are courageous. They're also unusually caring. The culture teaches us to care about women and children. That comes more naturally. But caring about men is unusual. And these people do it. They're unusual. And so we have a genuinely exceptional group of people forming the governing body of the Canadian Centre for Men and Families in Ottawa. This is an organization that is absolutely leading the way, leading towards a future that will be genuinely about gender equality. These people deserve your support. When I stepped down as chair of the board a couple of months ago, two truly remarkable people stepped forward to lead the organization. All of the individuals on this board contribute at a high level. But it's no small thing to step into formal leadership in an organization which is still misunderstood in the community of social service agencies, the media community, in the wider population. So I feel more than confident in the leadership of the two board members who've stepped up to co-chair. And I have a special presentation to make to each of them. It's a book, The Boy Crisis. You've just heard from Warren Farrell. These are individually dedicated copies of The Boy Crisis. So would Meg Raquette, co-chair, step up? And John Robson. Thank you both for stepping into this amazing role. And finally, Victor Maltby has been with us from the beginning for 4 years, helping organize our national conference, hosting showings of the Red Pill, opening the center last year, serving as our treasurer until last week. He's stepping down from the board in order to focus his energy on starting men's sheds across Ontario. Men's sheds are an innovation, a movement started in Australia focusing on older men who are often socially isolated and providing them opportunities to meet with practical projects and to spend time with other men. So somehow I have lost, here it is. Victor, we have a card that we've all signed, and I'd like to have you come forward and be recognized for your service. So thank you all. That's the end of our formal talks. Thank you for coming. Please do give as much as you reasonably can afford. There is, as we've heard, no government money for this work. There's one or two private foundations that are able to see their way to supporting this kind of work, but it's just about all private donations. We depend on you. Thank you.
We're not quite done. Obviously, I have to thank David very much for everything that he has done and is doing. Also, you all know that the empty drum makes the loudest sound, so I get to have the microphone. It's in fact my colleagues on the board. We couldn't have dragged Meg up here with wild horses, but I assure you that she was more worth listening to than me. I want to thank all our speakers, those who are here in person, and also those who joined us by Skype. Erin Pizzi, Cassie J, Karen Strawn, Warren Farrell, Barbara Kay, and of course Candace Malcolm. Terrific afternoon. But the people I really mostly want to thank are you who have come here, who are supporting the organization, because without you it just couldn't happen. It is your support that makes the center a reality. Thank you so much. If you want to continue bidding, we will stay here. We do have those stripe readers and things like that, so please do take a look at the items. If you're done now, again, thanks so much for coming. Goodbye, and we really appreciate your support.